everyone. Welcome to the third and final day of our Symposium FACETS. I have the great honor to welcome Jean-Marie Klinkenberg and to introduce him. Jean-Marie Klinkenberg is Professor Emeritus at the University of Liège, where he held the chair of Semiotics and Rhetoric. He's a great and world-renowned semiotician, but he's also specialist in French-speaking cultures and sociolinguistics. He participated in the renovation of rhetoric within the transdisciplinary collective known as Group MU, and has contributed to the recent development in semiotics towards a consideration of the social and cognitive dimensions of meaning. He is honorary president of the journal Signata. We closely collaborate, and he represents Belgium at the International Association for Semiotic Studies, and he has been elected president of the International Association for Visual Semiotics 4 times. Doctor honoris causa of several universities. He is also commander of arts and letters and officer of the Order of Academic Palms in France, and he is member of the Royal Academy of Belgium. He has published some 700 works in semiotics and rhetoric. Some are published alone, for instance, Licence Rhetorique in 1990, 7 Leçons de rhétorique de sémiotique, 96, Précis de sémiotique générale, 2000, and published with the group MU. He began its career with Rhetorique Générale in 1970. That is a classic in the humanities and social sciences, translated into 20 languages. They wrote together the Traité du signe visuel, a seminal book in visual semiotics. And the latest book is Principia Semiotica, published in 2015. He's also active as an essayist. He wrote about Liège, for instance, his beloved city. And he received in 2016 the Political Book Prize for an essay entitled Language in the City. Marie, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria Giulia. I must begin by asking for your indulgence for my awful English. As Maria Giulia explained, much of my work has been undertaken in the frame of the group MU. Now, working in a group has some curious consequences. One of on which is this: we did, as a group, we did the same thing that the Pope did in the 15th century by dividing the world in 2 parts, one for the Portuguese, the other from the Spaniards. So in our group, one of us was a specialist in visiting countries where English is spoken, while I was more missionary for the Indians in the areas where Romance language are spoken. That's explained that I got only in touch with English at late stage. And so today, I am not sure I understand what I am going to say. The theme of face recognition is central to both cognitive psychology and optical recognition technologies. The first one has demonstrated that the role of the face in communication is so fundamental that evolution has determined the development of regions in the nervous system that are particularly involved in face perception, such as the fusiform face area. In their famous model, Blues and Young have clearly demonstrated the existence of several structural modules for face identification. One of them deals with the variable feature of face, for example, those affected by emotion, while the second module deals with invariant feature. For example, the measurement of the distance between the eyes or the bridge of the nose. It is the operation of this second module that biometric facial recognition programs prefer to model, even though the recognition of emotion has made spectacular progress. Whatever it is the mechanism that humans use in their daily social life or the modeling developed by facial biometric technologies, their success is linked to the ability that each of these procedures has to articulate spatial data. In other words, to analyze them into their components and to aggregate these components. This double mechanism of subdivision is grouping is what makes meaning of our experience. It is the foundation of our knowledge of the world, as the thing is demonstrated in our Principia Semiotica. Inspired by linguistics, semiotics has developed a model to account for this double mechanism, calling it articulation. Articulation is defined as the property of a semiotic unit to subdivide into smaller units that are combined with each other or to combine with others to produce new units of a higher rank. This produces hierarchies that combine the two requirements of economy and efficiency. I would like today to take up the question of the articulation of the iconic sign. I will focus on the example of the face, but I will not limit myself to the letter as the question has general relevance. The most suitable the most suitable model for the perceptual representation of visual stimuli has been provided by Stephen Palmer. This cognitive model is available for translation into semiotic terms. Another interest of the model is that it tends to synthesize the two approaches, atomistic and holistic, often presented as irreconcilable. It does so in the form of a hierarchical network of structural units where at each level, the units are defined both as a set of global properties and as a set of parts, which Palmer calls atomic properties. Structural units are therefore defined by two types of properties. The global properties are, and I quote, quantitative values along perceptual dimension specified in relation to a certain reference. For example, the size of an eye will be determined by the nose size of the head. But global properties can be based on more than just dimensional shapes. They can also be properties of color, properties of texture. These global properties are intrinsic. I identify an eye because it has special configuration that correspond to those of the cultural type of a line model. Circularity, contrast between concentric zone, for example. They are said to be global because they transcend, for the level considered, any subdivision of the unit. Structural units are also defined by mereological properties that Palmer called atomic. For example, the representation of the head can be defined as a set of two eyes, a mouth, a nose, etc., placed in a specific respective position. These atomic properties are extrinsic. They involve the relationship between several elements, and in particular, relation of subordination or superordination. The head is subordinate to the body is superordinate to the head. These properties are called atomic because they necessarily involve a process of analysis of the unit into units of a lower rank. Despite its imperfection, which I will return to. Palmer's model is constitute an elegant starting point for the analysis of visual messages from a semiotic point of view. We note indeed that the author is careful to emphasize that the decomposition into units structures the act of perception and does not imply that the structural units chosen have a real existence in the world, in the stimulus. I quote, they are in the mind, not in the world. The model needs, as I said, to be corrected in some of its points. I will examine successively the atomic properties, the global properties, and in synthesis, the status of the structural units. For the atomic properties, we note in the diagram the existence of a type of relation that must be distinguished from subordination and superordination, coordination, a relation here represented by the red horizontal arrows. It's clear that the unit can also be defined by its coordination relation with units of the same level. For example, semicircular patterns can be associated with the type head because I appear in a group of units with which they share certain global properties, units which their properties necessarily make them perceived as faces. The coordination rests the level of redundancy and allowed the identification of the type head. In addition to subordination, superordination, coordination, a fourth type of relationship can be considered, which no longer involves space, but time, preordination. This is because visual objects, it's what was demonstrated in these 2 days, visual objects frequently occur in temporal sequences, and this sequence also raise the level of redundancy. This point is well illustrated by the example of Cheshire cat's head, which constantly appearing and disappearing in front of Alice is reduced at time up to her smile. Finally, the word atomic itself is not very relevant. Its etymology suggests that the units are not themselves decomposable, which is not the case. As we shall see, the decomposition process is in principle infinite, even if in practice it is not. The so-called global properties are perhaps not so global as I seem, because they imply a certain degree of analysis. In order to demonstrate this, let us start from Palmer's examples. Properties such as elongation, roundness, which take on a given value for a given structural unit, for example, for elongation, value of the length-width ratio, we can see that these values are positioned on what we could call a visual axis, by analogy, by the axis described by linguistic semantics. An inventory of these axes has yet to be made, but it would probably include angular, rounded, elongated, compact, etc., etc. Now, the same axes are found at all levels where they are each time assigned a value. These values are therefore perfectly articulable, and it is this articulation that provides a truly global property. It is on such conjunction that the opposition of the global silhouette of phasmid, an insect also called stick insect, and a beetle is based, because in these 2 cases, the value of elongation axis is the same at each level. High level for the phasmid, low for the beetle. The general pattern of the phasmid is elongated, but also that of its leg, antennae, etc. The beetle is compact, but so are its elytra, thorax, abdomen, etc. When, on the contrary, the value of a visual axis differs strongly at its level, the resulting composition participates weakly in the global properties. This is shown here, where the encapsulating unit has an elongation ratio of 1:1, while the encapsulated units all have high elongation. It thus seems that the intrinsic properties are actually a combination of higher ordered properties. We can then conclude that the sole objectively describable properties are the extrinsic, the atomic properties, and that the intrinsic, the global properties are always partial and hypothetical subjective synthesis. This is important because it allows us to distinguish between the way in which the identification or reference by the human subject and facial biometric work, while the biometry can be based on global properties thanks to the power of the computer equipment, human pattern recognition seems to emphasize intrinsic procedures. All this observation leads to a semiotic reformulation of the visual information model. It emphasizes the dialectical relationship that is established between units and parts of unit. While the critique of the notion of global property and the reformulation of all properties in terms of relationship relativize the opposition between the two types of determinants, the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic is still useful to account for the different possibilities of identifying a structural unit. An eye can be identified either because it has the shape of an eye or because it is located in the place of an eye in the face unit. All in all, a given unit can be identified both by what is it and by what isn't, in accordance with the structuralized doxa, for which meaning is necessarily oppositional. Although my example have all been an illustration of the iconic sign, I recall that what I have discussed so far is valid for any visual perception. The moment has come to apply this notion to the iconic sign as recognized in its specificity. To do this, we need to refine the notion of determiner. This will lead us to remember that a sign, it's very banal. As a sign, the icon is made up of indissociable set of signified and signifier, iconic signified, that we call type, for reasons explained in our treatise on the visual sign and too long to recall here. The Saussurian principle of solidarity between signifier and signifier as a consequence here that if we discuss the signifier and the type successively, we will each time be confronted with problems relating to the other category. And it is the signifier through which the type are manifested can be articulated into units of lower rank. But this articulation can be performed in two distinct ways. According to the first, we obtain units that are themselves the signifier of an iconic type. Head decomposed into eye, ears, nose, etc. According to the second approach, this unit, the unit obtained, do not correspond to any type, but can be described as simple formal properties allowing the recognition of the type. Here is the example of a head, which is described this time as the organization of curves and straight lines having a certain relationship of lengths or angles. In the first case, we will refer to a decomposition into subentities, and the other to a decomposition into marks. Both the subentities and marks constitute the determiners of the Dekoninck signifier. The marks correspond to Palmer's global properties, while the units of the family of entities correspond to his structural units. If we call the signifier of a type at level n an entity, we will call the units of level n minus coming from the decomposition of its signifier sub-entities, while they correspond to a type. The sub-entity of a given entity does correspond to a referent, which can be integrated into another referent corresponding to a stable type. It goes without saying that the entity can, in the other direction, be associated with other entities to create at higher level n plus 1, n plus 2, etc., plus 2, new signifier that we call superentities. The signifier head as constitutive of the superentity corresponding to body, n plus 1, the latter as constitutive of couple or regiment, n plus 2, and so on. Let's observe that the status of determiners, the subentity in reference to the entity, and determinant, the entity in reference to the subentity, are never fixed. And this remark will also apply to the level of type. In a given iconic statement or in a given description of the statement, a given signifier element will be designated as determinate, as the elements that are subordinate to it in this context will therefore be described as determiners. A drawing where head is an entity and eyes, mouth are subentity. But in other contexts, the signifier that was determined in the first context will have a subordinate status and will therefore become determiner, for example, the head in a silhouette. As we can see, the respective statuses of determiner and determinant are fixed by a first instance, the particular organization of an iconic statement. But a second instance intervenes, the cultural constraints affecting the repertoire of type. In principle, the lability of the articulation into determinate and determiners knows no limits, neither upstream nor downstream, but in practice, the process is constrained by the organization of the reservoir of type itself. Thus, to continue using the same example, if nose is a determiner of head in a context A, it can certainly, in other contexts, become a determinant whose determiners would be bridge of the nose, nostril, etc. However, it's difficult outside of very special context, such a medical treatise, a physiognomic treatise, or a collection of close-ups, it's difficult to pursue the analysis much further and to make, for example, nostril a determinant. The signifier will not correspond, in fact, in the most common cultural competence to a stabilized and sufficiently autonomous type. If the delimitation between determiners and determinant is floating and labeled, it must be also underlined, that the relationship is dialectical. Two cases possible. In the first case, a set of features is identified as constituting the signifier of head, because the subtype eyes and nose has been identified. In the second case, since the head type has been identified, and we know that this is organized into eyes and nose, the signifier corresponding to this type is isolated, recognized as being compliant, and consequently receive their status of subentity. Let it be sufficient to note that there is a reciprocal semantization between determinates and determiners describable in terms of redundancy. The articulation of the signifier into determinants leads, in fact, to a limit. Beyond this limit, entities corresponding to types can no longer be articulated into subentities corresponding to subordinate types. However, it is possible to describe them. As already mentioned, we call this manifestation marks, defined by the absence of correspondence with a type. The opposition between marks and entities naturally suggests a comparison with the linguistic distinction between units of first and second articulation. Entities which are significant should correspond to types, while marks would only have a distinctive function. However, we must beware of the following. The analysis in marks doesn't necessarily succeed the analysis in some entities. On the contrary, it can be applied simultaneously. In other words, we can always avoid analyzing the signifier into entities. This signifier can be directly analyzed into marks. And this is what biometric facial recognition does. Thus, the signifier corresponding to head, the entity head, can be articulated in subentities as nose, but also directly in marks, circular control, superativity, for example. Any identified type can be seen either as a part of higher order set or as itself constituting a set of units of lower order. We can then supratype and subtype. So there are no objects that are types, subtypes, or supratype in themselves. They receive the status from the level of analysis at which we are situated. In principle, this level of analysis are unlimited in number, both upward and downward. If an entity is recognized, it is because it is identified as belonging to a type, and this belonging involves its potential belonging to all the supratypes that encapsulate this type. If I take the example of a chain, Massimo, European, human being, mammal, at each link in the chain, other supratypes can be considered: Italy, semiotic researcher, youth, etc. However, just as the analysis in subdeterminant, which is in principle limited, cannot be pursued in practice beyond a certain limit, the process of articulating types cannot be pursued indefinitely. It is restrained by certain consideration. For example, if the type backpipe can be considered as well stabilized, it is only rarely perceived as a supratype composed by the reunion of this type chanter, blowpipe, bass drone, tenor drone. That is new for me, except by specialists, and I am not the specialist. The selection of a level of analysis seems to be determined by three factors, which are the presence of particular determinants. For example, the length of a nose stimulates the stabilization of the interpretation at the Cyrano de Bergerac level rather than at the human level. We can speak of orienting determinants. Second factor, the iconic context constituted by the global trends, the presence of a panache, for example, will orient the identification Cyrano. The third factor is the pragmatic context. Let's take this road sign as an example. Because it is part of the repertoire of highway code, the image it contains will be understood as referring to the category children and no father and daughter dancing or foot race. It is obviously culture and ideology that set the ideal levels of typical stability, which can always be revised. Let us take for the last development, let's take the example of the unit head. Its identification is guaranteed when subentity and marker integration operation is successfully completed. The list of subentities and marks are not finite because the list of the subtype of a type is a fuzzy set. Nevertheless, we can propose an example of such lists obtained through tests with Western students. These tests show that identification is successful when confronted with certain subentities and marks pairing, and that in other case, in the second case, for example, it is an easy. This reveals that there exists a cognitive hierarchy of subtype. Some of them are very prototypical, allowing easy identification of the type and strongly increase the degree of redundancy of the utterance. Strategies for choosing between prototypical and non-prototypical features are therefore available to the producer of iconic statement to enable him to reach the identification threshold. Thus, the typeface will be easily recognized if very typical subtypes such as eye and nose are present, but features such as mustache or body spot being less effective in this role, and moreover, unable to be identified without the recognition of their suprative gland. But the two prototypical features, eye and nose, do not necessarily have to be present in a face icon. In general terms, and this will be my conclusion, for a type to be recognized, it is not compulsory to have this or that feature. They are not necessary in sufficient condition in the constitution of the iconic sign. It's simply necessary to reach a minimum rate of identification, which is achieved by the free association of features, which are in limited number. Arriving at the conclusion, I am well aware that my contribution would only fit very imperfectly into the project of this symposium if this symposium would have to be defined only by the contribution of technological device to visual meaning, but our meaning also aims to contribute to the new challenges of cognitive visual semiotics, and it therefore seemed relevant to return to the foundation of the modeling of visual meaning by insisting of their cognitive aspects. Thank you for that.